Live, Corbin Trent, Executive Director of A Fight Worth Having. That's a progressive political action committee. We also have Mehek Cooke, Senior National Security and Legal Analyst for the Daily Signal. And Mehek, straight to you now on Donald Trump's endorsement of Ken Paxton, which has not exactly been getting positive feedback, I guess, here on Capitol Hill. We heard Senator Lisa Murkowski, Republican, today saying that Texas is all but lost to Democrats now. What do you make of that endorsement by President Trump?
Well, I think that many people in Texas are excited that President Trump finally weighed in, because what we saw with Paxton, and many strategists see this, but people right there in Texas were saying there were too many twos with the previous person, Cornyn. He sat there and it was too long. He continued to become too Washington and less Texas. He continued to be too liberal and not for the working class. And they wanted to change the page. So when President Trump weighed in, he's actually looking at who's going to move that needle and be a fighter. And he didn't want complacency. I think many people in Washington on both sides of the aisle today continue to treat their seats as a throne rather than a position of leadership. And it was time to make that change. So I'm proud that President Trump has stepped in. Yeah, Ken Paxton, certainly maybe the more MAGA of the two candidates, but both of them were supporters of President Trump. And Corbin, over to you, because the feeling is that Mr. Paxton could have a tough time in the general election if he does get there. Do you think in the end that this move might actually end up helping Democrats in the state of Texas?
No, not really. I don't think so. I think Paxton, Cornyn, I don't believe it much matters. I think it's going to be a tough race regardless of who's in there. I think a lot of these elections are going to come down to partisan lines, and then a handful of, of independent voters that are going to be basing their votes on how they feel about which party is going to represent them the most. I don't think it's going to come down to personality so much, but maybe I'm wrong. But I think Paxton's a troll. I think he's good at getting attention, and he's what Trump needs, which is a lapdog, to help make him more deals like the one he made for the $1.7 billion slush fund.
Well, that runoff election, that's one we're going to be watching in the coming days and weeks. And, of course, there are other races happening tonight. And, Mehek, we've seen the president endorsing challengers to Republicans that he views as maybe disloyal or who didn't follow the party line on certain issues. He certainly endorsed a challenger to Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy, who lost his primary race this weekend, and now backing a challenger to Thomas Massie there in Kentucky. Is there room right now, do you think, for any sort of dissent within the Republican Party? There is room for dissent. These are normal policy agreements which President Trump is willing to have. And many times he's sat down with the Republican Party to push them over the finish line, whether it was pushing for the big, beautiful bill, and now we're fighting for immigration. But at the end of the day, there are some individuals in the Republican Party that are pushing against everything that we promised. We had a clear mandate to make sure that immigration enforcement was number one and that we were going to put American interests first. You see somebody like Thomas Massie, who fought against the big, beautiful bill. Those were promises that President Trump made in terms of tax relief for working class Americans. Now we're seeing Massie fight President Trump's executive order or executive power when it comes to the war in Iran. So these are places where President Trump feels it's a non-negotiable. We have less than 4 years to deliver one of the greatest presidencies and making sure that we get back to square one, working class families, delivering tax relief, and a safer America. So people can disagree, but I think Thomas Massie just crossed the line because he continued to fight every promise that President Trump made. Well, Corbin, what do you make of what we've been seeing with the president?
Line.
Yeah. Well, I think we should talk about. Let's talk about that because
many Republicans were for Epstein releasing the files, so that's not accurate.
Corbin, let me ask you first about Epstein, then I'll come back to you, Mehek. I mean, this was obviously his big push here. He was one of the co-authors of the bill to release all the Epstein files, really in the beginning of the term when President Trump didn't seem to want to do that. Do you think that played a factor here?
I mean, I think his, he was the one of the people that co-authored the discharge position. The president also brought in people like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene and tried to whip them into shape and push them on the Epstein stuff. There's no question that the president was very irritated that he was hurting his people when it came to pushing the Epstein files out. And then absolutely, when it comes to the war in Iran, the American people do want to see the executive branch restrained a little bit, to see that the executive can just push us and pull us into wars willy-nilly. It's been a problem since Bill Clinton. It's been a problem before that, and it needs to be taken care of. And I think folks want to see war powers resolutions passed, and there's some Republicans that are willing to do it. And I'm, hats off to him. I'm not a huge fan of Thomas Massie. He's a little libertarian for me, but I sure hope he makes it tonight.
Well, Mehek, and we'll be watching that race, of course, closely tonight. But on the Epstein files, this was something that President Trump did campaign on. He said he would release the files, and once he made it into office, he seemed a little bit more reluctant to do that. So that was something actually that voters wanted, that Republicans wanted. So in that way, potentially, maybe you would expect to have the support of President Trump.
Well, there's no doubt that Republicans wanted the release of the Epstein file. We've seen lots of releases through the DOJ where there was reluctancy, was making sure that minor information didn't come out. And remember, the last 4 years, Joe Biden sat on these files. So President Trump wasn't trying to target Republicans who opposed him. This has always been about President Trump's agenda, what Republicans are willing to bifurcate and push past these procedural things like the filibuster and actually deliver for the American people. We continue to see politicians make promises in Washington but never deliver. And this is where President Trump is actually changing the name of the game. His endorsement matters now more than ever. And somebody like Thomas Massie, it wasn't just one issue. Like I said, it was a myriad of issues. And it actually started September 2025 when he first opposed President Trump's agenda. And it continued. You continue to see individuals, policy disagreements are fine, but Massie also tried to go to Elon Musk and have individuals challenged that stood with President Trump's big, beautiful bill. That's all out warfare. That's not just one policy line. So we have to be honest with the American people. It really was about.
How's that big, beautiful bill worked out for people?
Well, I think there's a lot of
the
tax
fact
relief.
is that Americans aren't doing very well. Americans still have a real hard time affording housing, health care. They still have a hard time affording child care. People are working harder, longer, for less. We've had 8 years now, almost 8 years of this man who, with empty promises to redeliver great American prosperity through production, great American resurgence of manufacturing, and it's not happening. We've seen America when it's been put to the, pointed to the direction of rebuilding our manufacturing base. And that happened during World War II in the arsenal of democracy. And we were going from field to factory in 18 months. What this man's done really, really effectively is line his pockets. He's lined his pockets with cryptocurrency. He's lined his pockets with deals in the Middle East. He's helped Jared Kushner line his pockets. This is one of the more corrupt presidencies that we've ever had. You're right about that. It is
President Trump's only been president for 4 years. Correction there. It was Joe Biden that you were talking about in terms of manufacturing and lining his pocket.
Let me just
I'm quite sure who I'm talking about. Who's had
go back to
more
that
than
Kentucky
$1 billion.
Let's just focus back in on that Kentucky primary race because it is taking place tonight. A lot of eyes on that and a lot of money spent there. We're talking about $30 million spent on television ads. Again, this is just a primary race. This is the most expensive House primary in history. Mehek, what do you make of those numbers, and what do you think that says about American democracy? Is it healthy for American democracy?
Well, I think both sides are spending exorbitant amounts today because they're trying.
Listen, this is a Republican primary. This is two Republicans running against each other. $30 million.
And it doesn't surprise me when you see Democrats do the same thing. There's always going to be a push and pull, but this just shows you the gravity of this race. This will really mark whether President Trump's endorsement and whether his agenda is really what people in America want today, which is, again, a safe and secure border. The fact that we're fighting Democrats today on funding for Border Patrol, on funding for ICE, on making sure Americans are secure is sickening. So this is the biggest test, in my opinion. We'll see. If Massie's able to squeak by, well, then I guess there are dissenters out there that aren't happy with the mandate that President Trump was given. But this is exactly why we're seeing so much money.